Well, we are just steps away. I don't know about steps away, but we are 2 days away, I can tell you, from the interim budget. And we caught up with Sonal Varma of Nomura and Pranjul Bhandari of HSBC to talk about budget and elections. I had this conversation on what the budget expectations are.
We think both state and central government capex is going to grow at a slower clip in FY 2025. Now, both of them were very high in FY 24, and actually that was a blessing in disguise. There was no private sector capex takeoff that we had expected earlier, so that didn't really happen. But what instead happened was that there was construction-led demand wages for rural Indians. A lot of rural Indians who were disappointed because it was an El Nino year and their production was weak, their wages were weak, were able to get alternate employment in the construction sector. And if we track the remittances from urban to rural India, that really took off over the last 12 months. And that basically, gave some cushion to rural incomes. And that's why today we are not in a position of a big rural distress that a lot of people had feared. So, government capex helped in more than one ways. But I think in the next 12 months, we have to become very careful because this kind of sort of support may not be there. In fact, when we calculate our fiscal impulse and we sort of account for better quality spend now that the government is doing far more capex, for the first time since FY19, we think in FY25, there will be a drag on the economy. The fiscal impulse will turn negative. Now, is this all bad for growth? Maybe not, because our sense is that if fiscal is taking a step back, we're expecting monetary policy to take a step forward, and we think the central bank will be able to keep much more looser monetary conditions over the next 12 months than it has done over the last 1 year, and that instead could become the support to growth. So FY25 is going to be a very interesting pivot year in which the government takes a back seat, but the central bank takes a step forward. Now, how will the central bank do this? Our sense is that it won't be in any hurry to cut the repo rate. The global environment remains far too sort of uncertain. The Red Sea issues, there are elections across the world. Our sense is they're going to use, the more nimble parts of their policy tool, which is liquidity. They tightened liquidity substantially over the last 12 months. Our sense is they're going to ease liquidity. And to be very honest, just by easing liquidity, they can actually de facto give you a rate cut, something that feels like a rate cut of about 40 to 50 basis points. In fact, just going by the actions of the central bank, last week, they have increased the amount of liquidity they are ready to give in their 14-day repo window, in their 2-day repo window. And I think actions like that will continue. And overall, monetary easing will be the way ahead over the next 12 months. In terms of growth numbers, I do think there'll be, a slowdown in growth. So our sense is that GDP growth could be about 50 basis points lower in the next year than it was in the previous year. But we don't think that's a big problem. Growth has been extremely strong. 50 basis points, slightly lower growth, is not a problem. The reason we don't think growth will be any slower than that is because we think services could become a big driver of growth over the next 12 months. What we've seen is so far, India's post-pandemic recovery has been led mainly by manufacturers. Manufacturing GDP is 30% higher than pre-pandemic levels, but services growth is only 15% higher than pre-pandemic levels. So services has a big room to run, and I think that will really support growth over the next 12 months. In fact, we at HSBC just launched India's flash PMIs, and in the January data looks very encouraging because there's been a sharp increase in services activity, and if that continues to grow, I think that can provide some growth momentum that continues to last in the economy.
Pranjul, you've given us a lot of food for thought. So let me pick up on this pivot that you've talked about. Sonal, wanted to get your thoughts in, on the point that Pranjul was just making, that more than Parliament, eventually next year, or rather this year, is going to be about what the RBI actually does. The ball is going to be in their court, and the shift will be totally towards the monetary stance as opposed to what the government does.
Yeah, we agree. I would agree with Pranjul's assessment. I think if you look at the current state of play, we do think liquidity conditions are way too tight. Some of this has happened because of government's high cash balance, but ultimately this is putting a lot of strain on banking system liquidity. And I think this situation of persistent tightness in banking system liquidity has now continued for many months now, with the call rate, in fact, above the upper band of the policy corridor, which is the MSF rate. So essentially something needs to be done about this in terms of injecting more liquidity, probably right now more via the frictional instruments that the RBI has, such as longer dated VRR. But if that by itself is not able to resolve the issue, then I think more policy measures will be needed. Yes, the sequencing, I think globally now the discussion is towards the timing and the pace of policy easing across central banks. And we do think a similar discussion is going to start in India with respect to the sequencing of the policy exit. We do think that the sequencing is going to begin with liquidity easing measures from the Reserve Bank of India, some of which could get announced in the policy decision that's coming up in early Feb, more via frictional tools to deal with this tight banking system liquidity. But over the coming months, we do think the policy stance of withdrawal of accommodation is a bit stale and should be changing back to neutral to remove that tightening bias. And third, then following through with respect to more repo rate cuts. If we take a step back here, I think while the headline growth numbers have been stronger than expected, I think the composition of growth has not been up to where we would like it to be in terms of broad-based growth. And second, despite the recurrent food price shocks, we have seen core inflation disinflate faster than expected. We are right now sitting at 3.8% on core inflation. The annualized momentum there is actually running closer to 3.5%. So I think that should give a lot of comfort to the MPC, because while we are in a 3 to 6 month period of higher headline inflation for most part of June 2024 onwards until end of FY25, we do see headline inflation converging to core inflation around 4%. So very high real interest rates should be one reason the MPC discusses and then decides to actually cut the repo rate.
You know, Sonal, want you to come in here because Pranjul and I were discussing earlier as to how the Feb 1st budget is also going to be a sort of precursor to the state budgets which are going to follow.
That's right. I think, states in general have been more constrained than the central government in terms of just the leeway that they have. And for them, the central government's loan grant on capex has definitely been of big help, particularly the front-loaded capex allocation that the center has given, because it enables them to plan ahead and actually execute on that capex. I do think that since private capex hasn't adequately become broad-based yet, it is still important for public capex thrust to continue, and that thrust needs to come through again, both from the central government and from the state government. Therefore, in continuation with the trend of the last few years, we do think the central government's loan support to states for capex should happen most likely in FY25 as well. So that at least from the state's perspective, the trend of capex continues at a time when private capex hasn't really picked up. Yeah, so I think that will be quite important. That said, I think if you look at the more recent numbers for state governments, we are seeing some pressure actually pick back up because of a slowdown in revenue growth that states are seeing in some of the categories. Therefore, the support from center to states, I think, will be important in ensuring that the state thrust on capex continues in FY25.
Also, Sonal, wanted to get your micro thoughts here, just getting a little granular. What do you think could be some of the focus areas in the interim budget? There is a lot of chatter that perhaps there could be something announced for housing, for instance, for the urban poor and the other, minority groups. Just wanted to understand your own thoughts here.
Yeah, so As I'd mentioned earlier, I think our view is that the budget will be aligned with the BJP's thrust on this Gyan strategy. So for the Garib or the poor, in terms of more affordable housing, but also higher allocations on pension, potentially on the insurance side. Enhanced coverage on that front.